today with this agreement, we come to agreement that that our reciprocal tariff rate will go down to 10% on the United States side, so it goes down 115%. We enter into a 90-day pause period for negotiations, which both the Chinese and the United States are very committed to, and the Chinese on their side also go down 115% to 10%, and they remove the countermeasures that they have in place. To be very clear, other measures that the United States has put in place in the past, whether it's tariff measures from 2018 or since.
So that was U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer on the breakthrough deal with China following high-stakes talks in Switzerland over the weekend. Joining me now, Gatestone Institute Senior Fellow Gordon Chang. And Gordon, good morning to you, and a lot to get through, but I just want to ask you this. You point out that you're not so much focused on comments from the U.S. side, you're focusing on what the Chinese said. And in particular, Vice Premier He Lifeng, I think that's how you say his name, you're focused on his language. What is it that he said that's got you not so excited about this deal?
We have seen the Chinese media in the last 24 hours still use very harsh terms against the United States. It's like, we will not bow down to the American type thing. Whereas you have very conciliatory talk from both Treasury Secretary Bessent and U.S. Trade Representative Greer. And that indicates, at least for the moment, that the Chinese regime has not changed its posture. The reason why that's important, Cheryl, is because, it's not so much the tariffs that were keeping U.S. goods out of China. It was the non-tariff barriers. And I'm not so sure that we're going to see a change in those non-tariff barriers during this 90 days, which means that we are letting Chinese goods into the U.S. It's not clear that China is going to let our goods into China.
And you say, what trade deal has China ever honored? That's your open question here. And then you also say, why are we trading with the hostile regime? But, we have our supply chains are intertwined, for better or for worse, with China. And there was a huge impact on the U.S. economy pretty quickly when these tariffs went into place. You had dock workers out in California. The union was very upset because they were losing jobs because those ships from China had stopped arriving.
Well, the effect on China was much greater than it was on the United States. That was for a number of reasons, because we're not a trade-dependent economy as China is. The thing that concerns me, and you mentioned it, is that Vice Premier He Lifeng, he is the same guy who negotiated the January 2020 Phase 1 trade deal, which China dishonored almost immediately. That deal was very easy for China to comply with. All they had to do was buy specified amounts of U.S. farm products and U.S. manufactured goods, and they failed to do that. So we're dealing with someone who has, I think, deceived the United States before, and we've got to be extremely concerned about their posture right now, especially because there's a lot that's going on which doesn't relate to tariffs, which could keep and certainly have kept U.S. goods out of their country.
Well, but also, too, you have to remember, this isn't President Biden. There was a deal negotiated under President Trump, and then under President Biden, the Chinese were never held accountable at all for not living up to their commitments to our country. So I think there's a little more to explore there. But Liz Peek's on set with me. Gordon, just got a question for you.
Good morning, Gordon. I think one thing that we're seeing, and this is not because of recent tariffs, but it is an ongoing process, is that American companies are moving manufacturing out of China. Mattel, Apple, you name it, everyone is realizing that just what you're saying, the Chinese cannot be trusted. So isn't that the more important trend underway? I agree with you. The Chinese are never going to totally live up to their commitments on trade or anything else. They cheat like crazy. But if we have pushed and if we continue to push companies out of China, isn't that a win for America?
Well, it certainly is a win for America. This was something that started during the Trump administration, the first one, and we could see it continue through the Biden years as well, because companies realized that ultimately there was going to be trade friction between the United States and China, as well as geopolitical friction. And they had better start to diversify their supply chains, which have now become sort of supply webs because there are multiple suppliers. Ultimately, that's, yeah, I agree with you, is the bigger story. But the problem you have is that when you have this conciliatory language, it sort of then convinces companies, well, maybe they can stay. And Mattel is one company that has been very pro-China and has very much said it will keep its supply chains in China. So we got to see a lot more movement before we start declaring victory.
Well, let me pick up on this breaking news on Apple because they are considering, there's a new report in the Journal out just this morning, raising iPhone prices without blaming tariffs. This new report from the Journal is quoting people familiar with the matter, saying Apple is weighing price increases for its fall iPhone lineup, and the company is determined to avoid any scenario in which it appears to attribute price increases to U.S. tariffs on goods from China. Because most Apple devices are assembled in China. In particular, these are those high-end iPhones, your $1,000, Max Pro, and that they're not going to diversify out of China.
Well, on May 1st, Tim Cook said that in the current quarter, that most of the U.S. production for iPhones will come from India, not China, and that iPads and other devices will be coming from Vietnam. And so this goes back to Liz Peek's point about diversification of supply chain. Apple has the most difficult to move supply chain because it is so grounded in that ecosystem in China. So if Apple can move its production to India, well, then any company can. And I think we will see other companies do so as well for the reasons that Liz mentioned. It's just so important right now to be sure your supply chain is resilient, which is actually more important now than efficiency.
I want to ask you about what's happening within China. And we talked about this last week with Maria, but you had these protests by these workers. You had factory workers that are protesting. They're not getting paid. They're being let go. And we saw basically riots being reported out of China. You and I talked about that. But now these unemployed Gen Z Chinese are calling themselves rat people. They stay in bed. They avoid going to work. They scroll on their phones. They're protesting burnout, and they're protesting the current job market.
Yes, and this has been going on well before President Trump took his second oath of office. This has been going on since COVID, but even before that. And the reason is that there is not only the question of unemployment, there's also disillusionment and anger, and there is burnout. So you have that group in its 20s and 30s, they're just opting out of society. We now call it rat people, used to be lying flat. There are about a half a dozen terms for getting out of the system. And we now have the most recent one, which is, quote unquote, retiring, which are the most privileged segment of the Chinese population, the younger guys who are well-educated, great jobs. They're now giving all of those up. They're leaving the cities, and they're going back to their hometowns and taking up farming. So, that shows you the really substantial change in mentality in China. It's just disillusionment and anger.
Gordon Chang, thank you for being here on this breaking news on China and the U.S. and this tariff deal that has been signed. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Cheryl.
All right. We are going to be right back, everybody.